Marcus was 17 years old, tall for his age, with a lean build that came from hours of basketball practice. That Saturday afternoon had been like any other. He had gone to the community gym, played a few rounds with his friends, and laughed so hard that his stomach hurt. His friends always teased him for being the one who stayed quiet most of the time, but when he smiled, everyone felt lighter. He was the kind of boy who never looked for trouble. His mother often said he had an old soul, and maybe she was right. He carried himself with a calmness rare for someone so young. Even though his father was the FBI director, Marcus never acted like he was different from others. He wore simple clothes, sneakers that had been scuffed from months of wear, and a backpack that had patches from places he had visited with his family. Most of the kids at school didn't even know who his father was, because Marcus never talked about it. He wanted to be seen for who he was, not for the power his father held. On his walk home from the gym, the evening air was cool, and the golden sun dipped low in the sky. He had his headphones on, humming along to a song that made him feel alive. It was one of those moments where the world felt calm, and Marcus felt grateful for the little things: the sound of children playing in the distance, the smell of someone grilling food nearby, the crunch of leaves under his sneakers. He didn't know that in a few minutes, his whole day, and maybe his whole life, would change. Marcus turned onto a quieter street. It was a road he had taken countless times before, a shortcut that cut 10 minutes off his walk home. He liked this route because it was peaceful, lined with tall oak trees, and sometimes he would stop to take pictures of the way the light fell through the branches. His phone's gallery was full of little snapshots of beauty like that. He didn't expect anyone to bother him here. Just as he reached the corner, he noticed a patrol car slowing down near him. He didn't think much of it at first. Police cars often drove through the area, and he had never been the kind of person to worry when he saw one. But then the car pulled over, and two officers stepped out. "Hey, you," one of them called out. Marcus pulled out his headphones, confused. He looked around, thinking maybe they were talking to someone else. But the street was empty. "Yes, sir," Marcus answered politely. The officer, a tall man with sharp features, squinted at him. "What are you doing around here?" Marcus blinked, surprised by the question. "I'm just walking home from the gym," he said, lifting his backpack slightly as if to prove his words. The second officer crossed his arms and frowned. "You live around here?" "Yes, sir." "Just a few blocks away," Marcus replied. His voice was calm, but inside he felt a tiny spark of unease. He had heard stories everyone had, but he never thought it would happen to him. He had always believed that if you were respectful and honest, things would be fine. The officers exchanged a glance that Marcus couldn't quite read. One of them stepped closer. "Mind showing us some ID?" Marcus reached slowly into his backpack and handed over his wallet. The officer flipped through it, his eyes narrowing. He muttered, as if something about Marcus still didn't sit right with him. Marcus stood quietly, his hands at his sides, trying not to seem nervous. He remembered his father's words from long ago: "Always stay calm. Always be respectful. That's how you keep control of the situation." The other officer circled around Marcus, eyeing him up and down. "You sure you belong in this neighborhood? Seen a lot of break-ins around here lately." Marcus felt his stomach tighten. He had lived in this neighborhood for years. He knew the families, the children, even the dogs that barked every morning as he passed. Yet here he was, being asked if he belonged. He wanted to shout that this was his home, his safe place, but instead, he took a breath and said, "Yes, sir. I've lived here since I was 10. The officers didn't look convinced. Marcus noticed how one of them kept his hand close to his belt, and his pulse quickened. He thought about calling his father, but something inside told him that would only make things worse right now. He didn't want to seem like he was challenging them or using power against them. He wanted to be seen as just a kid walking home. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. Marcus wished someone he knew would walk by, someone who could vouch for him. The street felt suddenly too empty, too quiet, as if the world had stepped back to watch. Finally, one of the officers tossed his wallet back at him. Marcus caught it carefully and tucked it away. "You better watch yourself," the officer said. "People like you get into trouble when they think they're too confident." Marcus nodded slightly, unsure how to respond. His heart was racing, but he forced himself to stand tall. "I understand, sir," he whispered. As the officers stepped back toward their car, Marcus put his headphones away, no longer in the mood for music. The joy of his basketball game, the calm of his walk, the warmth of the evening, everything had been overshadowed by those few tense minutes. He continued walking, but the street no longer felt familiar. Each step felt heavy, as though the world had shifted in some small but important way. He realized that no matter how careful he was, no matter how respectful, there would always be people who saw him differently. Not as Marcus, the quiet boy who loved basketball and photography, but as something else entirely. As he neared his home, Marcus replayed the moment in his mind. He tried to understand what had made the officers stop him. Was it his hoodie? His backpack? Or was it simply who he was? The thought stung, and for the first time in his life, Marcus felt the weight of something his parents had tried to protect him from. When he finally walked through the front door, his mother noticed the change in his face immediately. "What happened?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Marcus hesitated, not wanting to worry her. "Nothing, Mom. Just tired." But as he went to his room, he knew it wasn't nothing. It was the beginning of something he couldn't ignore. Marcus thought the incident was over. He had made it home, safe inside the walls where his family lived, where his father's framed certificates hung on the walls and his mother's laughter often filled the rooms. He wanted to believe it was just a misunderstanding, a small moment that would never happen again. But deep inside, the unease stayed with him. He couldn't forget the officer's words, or the way they looked at him, as if he didn't belong. The next day, Marcus tried to shake it off. He woke up early, put on his sneakers, and decided to walk to a nearby store to grab a snack. It was only a 10-minute walk, and he thought the fresh air might clear his head. He texted his friend on the way, talking about basketball practice and the big game coming up. He wanted to keep life normal, to focus on being a teenager. But fate didn't allow him that peace. As Marcus walked down the same route as yesterday, he saw the same patrol car again. His chest tightened. He told himself not to worry, that maybe they were just passing through. He tried to walk with confidence, hands in his pockets, eyes forward. But the car slowed down. Then it stopped. The door opened, and the same officer stepped out. The look on his face made Marcus's heart sink. "You again," the officer said, his voice flat. Marcus swallowed hard and nodded politely. "Good afternoon, sir." "Where are you headed this time?" the officer asked, crossing his arms. "To the store, sir. Just a quick walk." The officer tilted his head, as though suspicious. "You always seem to be walking around here. What are you really doing?" Marcus felt a lump form in his throat. He wanted to say something clever, something that proved he didn't deserve this kind of treatment, but he remembered his father's words, "Stay calm. Stay respectful." So, he answered softly, "Just walking, sir. That's all." By now, a second officer had gotten out of the car. He walked slowly around Marcus, as though examining him. "You got anything on you? You hiding something?" Marcus shook his head quickly. "No, sir. Nothing." But his calmness seemed to annoy them. One officer suddenly stepped closer and said sharply, "Put your hands up." Marcus froze. He looked around. A couple of people were on the sidewalk far away, but no one close enough to step in. His heart raced, but he lifted his hands carefully. "That's better," the officer muttered. Then, without warning, he grabbed Marcus by the shoulder and turned him toward the car. Marcus stumbled but didn't resist. His mind spun. Why was this happening again? He hadn't done anything wrong. He was just a kid walking to the store. "Spread your feet," the officer ordered. Marcus did as he was told. He could feel the rough metal of the police car against his cheek. He wanted to explain, to say again that he lived nearby, that he was only going to get a snack, but his voice felt trapped in his chest. The officer began patting him down, searching his pockets roughly. Marcus stayed still, trying his best not to make the wrong move. But the way they treated him made it clear they didn't see him as a teenager. They saw him as a threat. "Empty your backpack," one of them demanded. Marcus carefully set his bag on the ground and opened it. Inside were only a water bottle, a basketball jersey, and his wallet. The officer kicked the bag with his boot, scattering the items. "Where's the stuff you're hiding?" he asked, his tone sharp. "There's nothing," Marcus said quietly. The officer narrowed his eyes. "Don't lie to me." The tension grew heavier by the second. People had started to notice now. A woman stood at the corner, holding her phone as if deciding whether to record. A man slowed his car to watch. The street had gone silent except for the sound of Marcus's shaky breathing. Marcus turned his head slightly, his voice low but firm. "Sir, I'm not lying. I'm just walking to the store." The officer's jaw tightened. "Don't talk back," he snapped. Marcus felt fear mixing with frustration. He had done nothing wrong, yet he was being treated like a criminal. He thought of his father and how disappointed he would be to see this. But he also thought of his mother, who always told him never to let fear break him. The officer suddenly shoved Marcus harder against the car. The force made Marcus's lip split against the metal. Pain shot through his mouth, and he tasted blood. He gasped but didn't cry out. His body trembled, but his spirit refused to give in. The second officer stepped back, crossing his arms as if satisfied with what was happening. "He's resisting," he muttered under his breath. Marcus's eyes widened. Resisting? He hadn't even moved. He wanted to scream that he was following every command, that he was doing everything they asked. But he knew arguing would only make things worse. Then came the moment that would change everything. One officer raised his leg and kicked Marcus's face while he was pressed against the car. The blow sent him collapsing to the ground. A sharp pain surged through his jaw, his vision blurred, and his ears rang. He lay there stunned, unable to process what had just happened. Gasps filled the street. The woman who had been holding her phone now held it up, recording everything. The man in the car rolled down his window, shouting at the officers to stop. But the officers ignored everyone around them. Marcus touched his face, feeling the swelling already starting. Tears blurred his eyes not from weakness, but from shock and disbelief. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, on the ground, humiliated and hurt. The officer grabbed his wrist and twisted it behind his back, snapping handcuffs onto him. "You're under arrest for resisting," he said coldly. Marcus's heart sank. He wanted to shout his truth, but his voice wouldn't come. His mind was spinning too fast, the world around him a blur of lights, voices, and pain. As they pulled him up roughly, he caught a glimpse of the woman recording. Their eyes met, and for a moment, Marcus felt a spark of hope. Someone had seen. Someone had proof. He wasn't invisible. But as the officers shoved him toward the car, Marcus realized the damage was done. The day that had started as a simple walk to the store had turned into a nightmare he could never forget. And none of them, neither the officers, nor the people watching, knew who Marcus truly was. They didn't know whose son he was. They didn't know the storm that was about to come. Marcus sat in the back of the police car, his hands bound tightly behind him, his cheek throbbing with pain. The cold metal of the handcuffs cut into his wrists every time the car bounced over a bump. His heart raced faster than the car itself, and though he tried to steady his breathing, fear kept pressing down on his chest. He stared out of the small window, watching the trees and houses blur past. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had only been walking to the store, but now he was being taken away like a criminal. On the sidewalk, people stood frozen, still processing what they had just seen. One woman, clutching her phone tightly, whispered to herself, "That boy didn't do anything." Her hands trembled as she replayed the video she had captured. She knew she had to share it, because the world needed to see the truth. At the station, Marcus was pulled out of the car roughly and led inside. He could hear laughter and casual voices in the background as if nothing unusual had happened. To the officers, it was just another day, another arrest. But to Marcus, it felt like his world had been turned upside down. He was pushed into a chair in a small room, the kind of room with pale walls and buzzing lights that made everything feel colder. The officers left him there for a moment, his hands still bound, his face sore and swollen. He lowered his head, trying to gather strength, trying not to let the tears fall. He wasn't weak. He knew he had to stay strong, but the weight of the injustice was heavy. While Marcus sat in silence, the outside world was already beginning to stir. The woman who had recorded the incident uploaded the video to her social media page with the caption, "This boy did nothing, and this is how he was treated." Within minutes, the video began to spread. People commented in shock, anger, and disbelief. Strangers who didn't know Marcus shared the clip, saying this was yet another example of unfair treatment that could not be ignored. At first, Marcus didn't know that the video existed. He didn't know that while he sat alone in that room, the truth was racing across phones, computers, and television screens. But he did know one thing: his father would eventually hear about what had happened. And that thought brought a strange mix of emotions. Marcus respected his father deeply. The man was not only the FBI director but also a father who had always taught him to walk with pride, to be honest, and to stand tall. Marcus admired his father's strength, but he also knew that his father was constantly under pressure. People watched every move he made. Marcus had always wanted to protect his father from unnecessary worries, which was why he never told him about smaller problems at school or in the neighborhood. But this time, the problem was too big to hide. Back at the FBI headquarters, a call had already been placed. A close friend of the family, who had recognized Marcus in the video, dialed the director's office. "Sir," the friend said urgently, "I think you need to see this." The director, a man known for his calm presence and steady voice, looked at the screen as the video played. His jaw tightened, his hands slowly curled into fists, but his expression stayed composed. It was his son. His boy pushed, searched, and kicked without reason. He watched as Marcus, who had always been polite and respectful, tried to explain himself but was ignored. He saw the blow that sent his son to the ground. The room grew silent as the director replayed the clip. His aides, standing nearby, didn't dare to speak. They knew what this meant. This wasn't just about any teenager on the street. This was about the son of the most powerful law enforcement officer in the nation. But for the director, it wasn't about power. It wasn't about titles. It was about his child. His heart ached as he thought of Marcus sitting somewhere, frightened and hurt, treated as though he didn't matter. The director rose slowly from his chair and made a single call to the local police chief. His voice was low but carried an unmistakable authority. "Where is my son?" he asked. On the other side of the line, the police chief nearly dropped the phone. Your son, sir." "Yes," the director replied firmly. My son, Marcus. He was taken by 2 of your officers. I want him released immediately. And I want those officers identified. The chief stammered, we didn't know he was. The director cut him off. You didn't need to know. He is a human being. That should have been enough. Back at the station, the officers who had brought Marcus in suddenly found themselves facing a wave of calls, messages, and orders from higher up. Their confident smirks began to fade. They had thought they were in control, but they hadn't realized who Marcus was. Meanwhile, Marcus sat in the small room, unaware of the storm building outside. He replayed the scene in his mind again and again. He wanted to understand why it had happened. Why did they stop him? Why did they treat him like that? The questions had no answers, only pain. Then the door opened. The chief himself walked in, his face pale, his smile nervous. Marcus, he said gently, you're free to go. Marcus blinked, confused. Free? But I didn't even do anything. The chief nodded quickly. Yes, we understand that now. You're free to leave. Your family will be here soon. As Marcus stood slowly, his wrists still red from the handcuffs, he realized something was happening. Something much bigger than just his walk to the store. He could feel the shift in the air, the officers outside whispering to each other, the rush of footsteps, the phones ringing non-stop. Something was wrong, but this time, it wasn't just wrong for him. It was wrong for the people who had put him there. Minutes later, the door opened again, and his father stepped inside. The director's face, usually calm and collected, was full of both relief and quiet fury. He walked straight to his son, placing a hand on his shoulder. Are you all right? He asked, his voice softer now. Marcus nodded, though his swollen cheek told a different story. I'm okay, Dad, he whispered. The director's eyes softened as he looked at his son, but when he turned to face the officers standing outside the room, his gaze turned cold as steel. They felt the weight of it immediately. The truth was out now. Marcus wasn't just a teenager who had been mistreated. He was the FBI director's son. And that meant the whole world was about to pay attention. The station was buzzing with attention Marcus could feel in the air. Officers moved quickly, whispering to one another, stealing nervous glances at him and his father. The calm they usually carried had been replaced by unease. It was as if everyone realized at the same time that what had happened could not be hidden. Marcus stood close to his father, his wrists still sore from the handcuffs, his cheeks swollen, but his back straight. He wanted to show his father that he was strong, that even though he had been humiliated, his spirit had not broken. His father placed a steady hand on his shoulder, both to comfort him and to remind everyone watching that this was not just about titles, it was about a boy who had been wronged. The chief of police appeared, his face red with embarrassment. He hurried over, bowing his head slightly as he spoke. Sir, we are deeply sorry for this misunderstanding. If we had known, the director raised a hand, cutting him off without raising his voice. Stop right there. You did not need to know who he was. He is a human being. He is a child. That should have been enough to treat him with respect. The words hung in the air like thunder. The officers nearby avoided eye contact, shifting uncomfortably. Some had seen the video already, others had only heard whispers. But all of them knew the truth now. The situation had gone far beyond their control. Marcus's father didn't shout. He didn't need to. His authority came not from anger, but from the calm, cold weight of truth. Where are the officers who did this? He asked firmly. The chief hesitated. They've been taken into the back offices for questioning. Bring them out, the director ordered. His tone left no room for debate. Moments later, the 2 officers entered, their confidence from earlier now gone. Their eyes darted around the room nervously, avoiding Marcus's gaze. For the first time, they realized the enormity of their actions. The director looked directly at them. You saw my son as someone who did not belong. You judged him without reason. You abused your power. And now you will answer for it? Neither officer spoke. The silence stretched on until the director continued, his voice steady but sharp. You thought no one was watching. But the world was watching. Cameras were watching. And soon, every person in this country will be watching. Marcus listened quietly, his chest rising and falling with slow breaths. He had dreamed of this moment while sitting in that small room earlier, the moment when the truth would be spoken aloud, when someone would finally call out what had been done to him. Now it was happening before his eyes. As the director spoke, the video continued to spread online. News channels picked it up, replaying the clip again and again. Viewers saw Marcus standing calmly, trying to explain himself, before being forced down and struck. They saw a teenager who had shown no signs of resistance, treated as though he were a criminal. Outrage grew rapidly. Messages poured in, demanding justice not only because Marcus was the FBI director's son, but because he was a boy who deserved dignity like anyone else. Back at the station, reporters had already started gathering outside, their cameras pointed at the doors, waiting for answers. Inside, the director addressed the police chief once more. Suspend them immediately. And open an investigation. Full transparency. No excuses. Yes, sir, the chief muttered, his voice heavy with regret. Marcus's father placed an arm gently around his son. We're going home now, he said softly. As they walked out together, the flashing lights of cameras met them. Questions were shouted from every direction. Is it true? What will happen to the officers? How is your son doing? Marcus squinted against the bright lights, holding his head high. His father did not stop to answer, but his silence spoke louder than any words. His presence was enough to show the world that something significant had taken place. That night, the story dominated every headline. Talk shows debated the deeper issues, community leaders spoke out, and families across the country gathered around their televisions, discussing what it meant. The video was no longer just about Marcus. It was about every young person who had ever been treated unfairly, every parent who had ever worried about their child's safety. In their living room, Marcus sat with his mother. She gently placed a cloth on his cheek, her eyes full of both sorrow and pride. I'm so sorry you went through this, she whispered. Marcus shook his head. It's not your fault, Mom. It's not Dad's fault either. It's just, the way some people see me. His mother's eyes filled with tears. They don't see you for who you are. But we do. And now the world will too. Later that evening, Marcus's father held a press conference. Standing before the nation, he spoke not as the FBI director, but as a father. My son was treated unfairly, he said firmly. But let me be clear, this is not just about my family. This is about every child, every person who deserves to be seen with respect and dignity. No one should face this kind of treatment. Not my son. Not anyone's son. Not anyone's daughter. Not anyone at all. The room erupted in applause. Reporters scribbled notes, cameras clicked, and millions watched live from their homes. Marcus, sitting quietly behind the stage, felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. His pain had not been in vain. His story was now bigger than him. It had become a call for justice. Meanwhile, the officers who had once acted with arrogance now faced a very different reality. They were suspended from duty, their names released to the public. Investigations began into their past actions. Complaints that had once been ignored were suddenly reopened. The system that had protected them before could no longer shield them. For Marcus, the following days were a blur of interviews, messages of support, and people stopping by their house to show solidarity. Friends from school texted him constantly, some in shock, some in admiration. "You're so brave," one message read. "We're all standing with you," said another. But Marcus didn't feel like a hero. He still carried the memory of that moment, the sound of the officer's harsh voice, the sting of being treated like he didn't belong. Yet he also carried something else, the knowledge that people had stood up for him, that truth had come to light. And that gave him hope. The fallout continued. Across the country, protests were organized, not in anger alone, but in unity. People marched holding signs that read, "Respect is a right and justice for all." Communities that had once felt silenced now felt empowered to speak. In quiet moments, Marcus sat by his window at night, looking out at the same street where everything had begun. The oak trees stood tall, their branches swaying gently in the evening breeze. He realized he still loved this neighborhood, still loved the simple act of walking home after a game. What had happened to him did not erase that. It did not erase who he was. He whispered to himself, "I'm still me." They couldn't take that away. The days turned into weeks, but the story of Marcus did not fade away. The video of him being mistreated had already circled the globe, and people continued to share it, not because he was the FBI director's son, but because it represented something deeper. It reminded everyone that unfairness could touch anyone, no matter who they were. Marcus tried to return to his normal life. He went back to school, back to basketball practice, and back to the little routines that made him feel grounded. But things were no longer the same. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Some gave him a look of sympathy, others a nod of respect. Friends treated him with a new sense of care, as if they understood he had walked through something heavy and come out stronger. At first, Marcus felt uncomfortable with all the attention. He didn't want to be seen as just the boy from the video. He wanted to be Marcus, the teenager who loved photography, basketball, and quiet walks home. But over time, he began to realize that what had happened to him had given him a voice. And maybe, just maybe, that voice could help others. One afternoon, his school invited him to speak at an assembly. At first, Marcus hesitated. He wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't used to standing in front of hundreds of students. But his father reminded him gently, "Son, just speak your truth. That's all anyone needs to hear." So Marcus stood on the stage in the school auditorium, looking out at faces both familiar and unfamiliar. He took a deep breath and began. "I never thought something like that would happen to me," he said quietly. "I thought if I was respectful and calm, everything would be fine. But I learned that sometimes, people don't see you for who you are. They only see what they want to see. And that hurts. It hurt me more than I can explain." The room was silent, every ear tuned to his words. Marcus continued, his voice steady. "But I also learned something else. I learned that the truth matters. That when people see the truth, they can't stay silent. That's why I'm standing here today, not just for myself, but for anyone who's ever felt invisible, or judged, or treated unfairly. You matter. Your voice matters." When he finished, the students erupted into applause. Teachers wiped tears from their eyes. Marcus felt a warmth inside his chest he hadn't felt since before that awful day. For the first time, he realized he could turn his pain into something powerful. Outside the school walls, the impact of Marcus's story continued to grow. Community leaders invited him and his family to meetings where people shared their own experiences. Activists reached out, asking Marcus to join them in raising awareness. Even though he was still just a teenager, he found himself at the center of a larger conversation about respect, fairness, and dignity. His father remained by his side through it all, guiding him but never speaking over him. "This is your story, Marcus," he reminded him. "I can fight as a leader, but you have the power to inspire as someone who lived it." And Marcus did. At one event, a mother came up to him with tears in her eyes. She hugged him tightly and said, "Because of you, my son feels less alone." At another gathering, a young boy whispered, "I want to be strong like you." These moments stayed with Marcus. They reminded him that while the pain of what had happened would never disappear completely, it had given him a chance to help others feel seen and heard. The officers who had mistreated him faced full accountability. They were not only suspended but also charged after the investigation proved what the video already showed. Their names became symbols of what needed to change. Marcus did not feel joy in their punishment. He wasn't the kind of person who wanted revenge. But he felt relief. Relief that the system had not looked away this time. Relief that people had spoken up. Relief that justice, at least in part, had been served. Months later, Marcus walked down the same street where everything had started. The oak trees still lined the sidewalk, their branches swaying gently. The street was the same, but he was not. He carried himself differently now, not with arrogance, but with quiet confidence. He knew who he was, and he knew the value of his voice. He stopped for a moment under one of the trees, remembering that day. He remembered the fear, the confusion, the pain. But then he remembered something stronger: the moment when people stood up for him, the moment when the truth could no longer be hidden, the moment when his father reminded the world that dignity belongs to everyone. Marcus pulled out his phone and snapped a picture of the sunlight breaking through the leaves. He smiled faintly. Life had come full circle. The boy who once walked the street silently now walked it with a purpose. At dinner that evening, Marcus spoke softly to his parents. "I've been thinking, maybe I can start something. A group at school, or maybe even online. A place where kids can talk about what they go through. A place where they don't feel alone." His mother's eyes lit up. "That's a wonderful idea," she said warmly. His father nodded proudly. "That's leadership, son. Not because of your last name, but because of your heart." And so, Marcus began his own small project. At first, it was just a group of friends meeting after school, talking about their lives. But soon, more students joined. Teachers noticed, then parents. Within months, Marcus had helped create a space where young people felt safe, supported, and valued. Looking back, Marcus realized that what had once been his darkest day had given birth to something brighter. It had taught him that even in the face of unfairness, hope could rise. That even when voices tried to silence you, truth had a way of being heard. He didn't forget the pain. He didn't forget the fear. But he also didn't let it define him. Instead, he chose to let it guide him. Years later, people would still remember the video of the boy on the sidewalk. But they would also remember what came after: the way he stood tall, the way he spoke with honesty, the way he turned his story into something that mattered. Marcus, once just a teenager walking home, had become a symbol of resilience. And though he never asked for that role, he carried it with quiet strength, knowing that his journey had the power to make others feel less alone. As he lay in bed one night, staring at the ceiling, Marcus whispered to himself, "They tried to make me feel small. But I know now I was never small. I was always enough." And with that, he closed his eyes, not with fear of what tomorrow might bring, but with hope. Because tomorrow, and every day after, he would keep walking with dignity, with courage, and with the unshakable knowledge that no one could take away who he truly was.